The WHO raised the threat level on swine flu to pandemic status. This was the first influenza pandemic since 1968. And, anecdotally, all of us felt the impact. Generally skeptical of any analysis that tries to calculate the economic impact of a pandemic like the swine flu. I think that if you just went for the basic analysis, which is somebody takes 2 weeks off work, and a third of the population, say of a country like Britain, which is perceived to be high risk this winter, takes 2 weeks off, a lot of people are worried, they stop going to the malls, to cinemas, demand falls. And that's when you begin to understand why the World Bank and Ernst & Young in a study said that the swine flu blow to global GDP could be about 5%. The aim of this session is not to debate what the economic impact could be. It is to look at how businesses can cope with pandemics, which are very real, swine flu a case in point, and to understand the partnerships between government, the private sector, the not-for-government sector, and how those partnerships can be implemented to contain the risk going forward. I have to do very little talking today because on my right are a set of people who understand the A to Z of what we're going to talk about. Let me introduce them to you. Kiran, Walia, Minister, Government of Delhi, Family Welfare, Women and Child Development and Languages. Minister Walia, it's a pleasure to have you here as our special guest at this session of the India Economic Summit. Thank you. On her right, Kewal Handa, Managing Director, Pfizer India and Wyeth Limited. On Ms. Walia's left, Professor Srinath Reddy, K. Srinath Reddy, President of the Public Health Foundation of India. Thomas Schweins, Vice President, Strategy and Marketing and member of the Executive Committee, QIAGEN. I did pronounce QIAGEN right. Yes. And Ramesh Subramanian, President, Asia Pacific Human Health with Merck. Thank you very much for being here this morning. And if I may request Minister Walia to make the opening comments for this session.
The experience of dealing with the epidemic has been learning for both the public and the private sector. For instance, in establishing regulatory processes, invoking an 1897 Act to compel patients to report and undergo treatment at public hospitals. As the number of cases increased, we invoked the same Act to ensure cooperation of private hospitals where there was an initial resistance to treat and set up infrastructure for H1N1 patients. We foresaw a higher incidence of the disease and proactively created capacity at the private health. Private diagnostic labs were also permitted to conduct testing, and we fast-tracked approval of their facilities despite numerous roadblocks. Ground realities dictated that we had to be far more liberal in testing for the infection, more liberal than that mandated by WHO guidelines. Another effective learning experience was information and communication management. For instance, we reached out to schools to disseminate information on the infection and issued advisories that were followed. This was extremely effective in the face of rising panic when many parents and school authorities felt the need to close down schools. The government intervened to prevent closure of schools that would not have served any purpose. Other than this, the government collaborated with Genpact, a GE company, to run a 24-hour call center manned by medical interns. This has been a fine example of private-public participation in the critical area of managing public queries. At this point, I would like to take a minute to talk about the role of the media, print, and television. The media helped in creating awareness of the infection and measures to control it. However, much of the media also sensationalized the issue, making it very difficult to keep panic levels down. For instance, names of patients were disclosed, and any high-profile person contracting the infection made headlines. The media created an alarmist impression that the disease was spreading at a rapid rate. While this may have served the media's interest of pushing up the TRPs, it had many negative implications. Government testing facilities were choked. For instance, about 200 people from Nerela village in Delhi landed up at an East Delhi hospital demanding to be tested, as there was one solitary case in the entire village. The hospital had to call in police to support and to manage the mob. Of course, as you may well imagine, this even for the media. Having said that, it was only when the media took a more balanced view of the situation that we saw levels diminish completely. A aspect of our response mechanism is considered and highly effective the QIAT, the quick response teams of doctors and paramedics that immediately contact tracing persons who are in close contact with the positive patients and provide them prophylaxis treatment. This team is mandated to make contact within 24 hours of a person testing positive and have made more than 22,000 such contacts. This feature of our response mechanism is most useful in containing the spread of infection right at its very source. In general, the public and private sectors have different objectives. In case of health, governments have a responsibility to enhance access to healthcare for all and set policy and regulation. Private players have a primary objective of maximizing value for their shareholders. In areas where these objectives have aligned, the public and private sector have worked successfully, including during the H1N1 virus outbreak. For example, private labs in Delhi augmented the government's capacity for analyzing H1N1 samples. However, there are several other areas where public-private partnerships can deliver better outcomes for pandemic preparedness and management, R&D, information sharing, and risk assessment. Pharma research and development organizations need to work closely with government health sectors on early warning signs for future potential pandemics. The public sector needs to encourage this research and make it cost-effective for the pharma companies to make the necessary investments. Proactively collaborating with pharma companies would obviate the need to make emergency purchases running into millions of dollars. Openly sharing of all available information and assessing risk of pandemic is critical to the success of any such public-private partnership. This includes sharing of all unclassified and classified preparedness, response, and recovery information. It is important that such collaboration and communication is considered on a routine basis so that processes of information sharing during emergency periods are well established. The legal framework needs to be revisited. It is evident that a law enacted in 19th century in India has limited effectiveness in the 21st century. We need laws that will balance the civil rights of the individual with the ability of the state to prevent a larger human disaster, as well as balance the intellectual property rights of the pharma R&D organizations with the social responsibility of the state to use knowledge in the interest of the people. This also includes the need to balance the regulatory oversight of the private healthcare system. This could be facilitated by having a national level coordination committee for pandemics with comprising representatives from all stakeholders. The H1N1 crisis provided us with many opportunities to evolve a more responsive and effective decision-making process, as well as to initiate a framework for private-public partnership and to evolve a methodology for transmitting information to a constituency much beyond the state of Delhi. Our responses and learning have formed the bedrock for future policy making on preparedness for pandemics and treating the disease. Thank you.
Minister Walia, thank you very much. I'm going to try and bring in the next logical step to this. You've touched upon the scope there is for public-private partnership. And Ramesh, if I can request you to take that thought forward, bring in the perspective of the private sector, because you did mention that at times there are alignment of priorities between the government and the private sector, and at times there is divergence. What's your assessment?
So first of all, just to introduce Merck. Merck is a all right, sorry about that. So Merck is a global biopharmaceutical company that is very active in both vaccines and pharmaceuticals, and I commend the minister for many of the points that she's made in terms of the public-private partnership, particularly around surveillance, monitoring, and the ability to control the flow of information in a positive way, so that there's neither an overreaction nor an underreaction. So I think that's commendable. I'll just take it from the point of view of managing a potential pandemic covers multiple issues, And clearly there's issues around awareness and education, because there are very many simple measures that an individual can take from a personal responsibility perspective that can actually prevent both issues for themselves as well as for the community. Beyond the awareness and education, there are issues around surveillance, making sure that the strains are quickly tested so that there is a central agency that is looking at the spread, the kinds of strains that are prevalent, and so on and so forth. I think there's room there for strong public-private partnerships, as you mentioned here, the role of private labs, for example. So I think that's a very critical area. However, as we think about particularly this potential pandemic, I think we have to recognize that seasonal flu has always been a very big issue in most markets and most countries. I mean, there's statistics that say that every year 20% of all Americans get the normal seasonal flu. And that alone is in the top 10 killers in the United States alone. Now, as we think about the way the flu vaccine needs to be developed, particularly new strain like the H1N1, there is enormous risk in terms of the need, the speed at which the vaccine needs to be developed. There's risk around the technology, the viability of the technology, the use of adjuvants, for example, and many very complicated scientific and technical issues that need to be dealt with. In the past, seasonal flu vaccines themselves have never been sufficient for anything like the world population. And in fact, the technology base, the egg-based technology is actually outdated. So new developments around cell-based technologies or virus-like particle technologies are very risky and need to be tested and proven. So here there is a significant role for public-private partnership across regulatory bodies, both individual country regulatory bodies as well as multilateral agencies that can assess both the risk and the viability of these new technologies. Now, this also means from a funding perspective, there has to be very proactive work between industry participants as well as multilateral funding agencies and individual governments, because the risk of either stockpiling too much which is not used later on or not having enough in the right places is very significant. So I think there is a significant role for public-private partnerships in both dealing with development of prophylactic measures like preventive vaccines, but also dealing with the post-exposure medications like the antivirals that are currently available, but not again in the kind of quantities that may be required.
I think it's time to sort of pause for a moment, Kewal, and I'm going to try and encourage you to do a post-mortem of India's handling, the centers being Mumbai and Pune and Delhi, I beg your pardon. Do a post-mortem of that and the learnings that you've taken away from it.
Well, that we have, this has been a day-to-day experience, and I thought that systems having put in place much before, so we knew this is the situation next week that's going to come. So that really helped us, and where the cities did not do this, they had to face much more graver situation, and it had become very critical. Besides, when you're talking of risk factor, I'd like to say that there is a lot of, I'm not a medical expert, but they say that, this may mutate the virus and maybe that is resistant to Tamiflu. There's another risk factor involved. So this is where, the medical, the academia and the pharmaceutical companies must share information that what would happen in such an eventuality, because we do keep hearing it during their conferences about this also. So we have to plan for
Yeah, Madhvi. I come from a state of Maharashtra. Last week, there was the 100th death in Pune. The WHO has confirmed there has been about 415 deaths and 13,000 confirmed positive cases. The first indications we got was in June when an IT student was tested positive. We didn't react till Reddy Sheikh died in August. There was no contract tracing program in place. Everybody woke up only in August, and there was panic in Maharashtra state. Schools were closed, malls were closed, events were cancelled, but still there was no sign of where the diagnostic facilities are. There were only 2 diagnostic facilities in Delhi and Pune. There was only one hospital in Mumbai where you could go and test yourself. And I happen to know somebody who said he took his daughter to a doctor and asked whether he can go to that hospital, happened to be Kasturba Hospital. The doctor said, do you want your daughter to be alive? I mean, there was no preparedness at all on the part of the government. I remember we had a meeting with the Maharashtra government, and Swati Piramal asked this question somewhere in June, is what's your preparedness for swine flu? And there was no response. There was absolute silence for a few minutes. And all I'm saying is there's a great learning we have. There's a great experience we have. And this is a right forum to take a stock of what went right, what we could have done better, what are the pitfalls that we want to avoid it. And I think from this learning, we need to move forward. We sort of forgotten about the swine flu now. Absolutely, if you ask somebody, we just don't know what swine flu all about. We have forgotten. Our memory is very short-lived in India. But where is the entire institution that would manage? Unfortunately, this is a state subject. And there is where the problem. You will find different treatments being meted by different states. They handle things differently. Where is a central body which looks at this and says, this is how we need to plan, this is how we need to execute? In US, there is a CDS, Center for Prevention of Diseases, which includes people from physicians, scientists, epidemiologists, biologists, and so on and so forth. And they are the one who directs and tells, and not the politicians. They are the one which build confidence. They are the one which brief media. They are in front of the people and say, this is what we are planning to do, and this is how we want to take it forward. I think these are the learnings which we need to put in place.
Emphatically put. And I'm going to bring in Thomas Schweins at this stage, because you have an understanding of how this has been, the coordination has been done around the world. Bring to bear here in this discussion successful experiences of coordinated action across the globe, so that there's something tangible we can take out of this discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, first of all, I represent the company QIAGEN. QIAGEN is a company that produces molecular tests so that we can monitor fast the spread of a virus. And we have been in contact with the WHO from the very beginning in early May, when this virus happened to start in Mexico. And the first question that I'd like to raise is, why should we care about a virus, a flu virus that comes more or less almost every year? Well, I believe the potential risk that we have with the pandemic based on flu is among the biggest risks we have as mankind, as a global society, and I'd like to highlight that. We have about every 20 to 30 years a pandemic that comes with a new virus, has a major threat, and that has the potential to potentially kill 50, 80, 100 million people around the globe. Not to talk about economical problems that are associated with that. And as a result of that, we as a global society need to prepare ourselves to really mitigate this risk. And I have to say that our interaction with the global stakeholders, especially WHO, tells me that there are really organizations that did a fantastic job, because you have to see that preparing for such an event where no one can really say how this works out at the end, because there are so many independent streams of activities, is really difficult to say. And I would compare this preparing for a pandemic like this, like 10 times organizing the Olympic Games without knowing when it happens. And I have to say, if I compare what has been done in the past half year relative to things like SARS, avian flu, and other pandemics, this is really world class. And we as a global society have really stepped up in a significant way. And just the fact that we today also have a discussion on it is really fantastic to my point of view. Have we done everything perfect? No. But I think we can learn from what we have done. We can learn from the mistakes. We can do better. We can prepare better for testing. We can prepare better for generation of vaccines. And what we also can do much better is involving the media, and that the media also sees its responsibility in helping to mitigate risk and helping to ensure that people don't panic.
I feel obliged to represent and answer on behalf of the media. I think there is a realization that the media itself, particularly in the Indian context, needs an orientation to addressing and covering a pandemic, and I think that, honestly, that realization has dawned. So hopefully we will also be able to deliver the news more responsibly going forward. But the scientist, Professor Reddy, we all have a sense of the seriousness of the situation. Now we want to understand, is there actually on the ground adequate facilities for detection, for surveillance? Are not-for-profit bodies coming together with government and the private sector? Is that blueprint being drawn together, leveraging on everybody's strengths?
Well, clearly, we need to prepare ourselves for early recognition and a rapid response for any pandemic, and ideally prevent a pandemic from occurring. We now recognize that in the last 3 decades, the world has seen, on an average, a new outbreak every year. And 60% of those are transmitted from animals to humans. I will talk later about what the private sector and the World Economic Forum can do to prevent that. But let's first deal with the response scenario here, and particularly in the context of the Indian experience. We do require very early recognition, and since most of these viruses produce influenza-like illnesses, we need first a clinical surveillance system which gives us very early information if the number of cases of influenza-like illness in the community are rising unexpectedly. And here, we not only need a very strong public sector surveillance system, which we hope the Integrated Disease Surveillance Program of the Government of India will shortly provide, but also a warning system that incorporates all the information that the private sector can generate. Not only the private sector healthcare providers, but every single private sector organization also can document if employees are suddenly reporting larger numbers of influenza-like illnesses. So we need a public-private partnership even from that level. Then, of course, we require stronger laboratory systems, which unfortunately are not in place now, but we do need, under the Integrated Disease Surveillance Program, as well as in the private sector, much better development and distribution of laboratory facilities across the country, not only concentrated in large urban metros, but across the country, because that is where we will be able to get our initial testing and sero-surveillance programs. Without sero-surveillance, we will not know what the community spread is likely to be. Then, in terms of actually providing the clinical response, obviously private hospitals also need to become partners in this whole process with public sector hospitals, and they need to prioritize treatment of influenza-like illnesses or other pandemics, essentially trying to accord higher priority to other routine cases. But the private sector becomes particularly important in the context of drugs and vaccines, right from the production, pricing, and the supply chain dynamics. And that is where we need a plan which ahead of time anticipates what is likely to happen in the case of an impending pandemic, tracks the evolution of the pandemic and models it a stage ahead, and then prepares in advance for the actual requirements of response, whether in terms of drugs or vaccines, and ensures. Lastly, I would say that the private sector has a tremendous role also in assisting the government and other agencies in risk communication to the people. The role of the media has already been spoken about, how mass hysteria was initially whipped up, and later on, of course, responsible sections of the media also undertook public education commendably. But governmental agencies and even scientists are not good communication experts. In fact, the skills in communication and marketing lie much more with the private sector. So in terms of social marketing, there is no reason why the private sector cannot step up and bring all of these skill sets into play, into effective risk communication to the public. So right along the whole stream of a pandemic recognition and a rapid response to a pandemic, including empowerment of the communities, I think the private sector has an important partnership role to play with the public sector. But in response to your specific question, yes, our surveillance systems need to be considerably better strengthened if we have to have any hope of responding to the current as well as any future pandemic with any degree of efficiency.
That's a very honest admission. So, what next? And I think one of the big concerns is that who takes the lead? Is it the central government? Is it individual state governments? Who will then coordinate between various state governments? And Minister Walia, you have that job of executing a solution. Tell me honestly, where do you think that ideal central body should be located and designed?
Well, in our setup, we already have a national government, and this is true that this is a state-ish subject. Health is a state subject. So there could be variations in the approaches to treating this disease, and putting the mechanisms in place, and that's why I was suggesting a national level coordination committee with all the state representatives. It's very important who not only, there'll be a pool of experiences and there would be so much to share, and there should be also representatives from the private sector, there could be representatives from the media, and a lot of things to be decided, also what information to withhold and what information to share. So this is another area where we have to go into, because media naturally would like to get access to all the information, and some of it could unnecessarily cause panic. And we were realizing, like, sometimes, news like, oh, there's shortage of Tamiflu, or it's the kits that are not going to be available from the market tomorrow, and they'll be getting n number of phone calls. Is this really true? So there was so much panic. And you know very well what happened in schools, but I must congratulate you that the particular channel that you represent was one of the first ones to be very responsible and took a very balanced approach, but that is not spread over all the channels. So this did really become a big issue. So we could have, representatives from all the stakeholders, from the pharmaceutical companies, from the private sector, hospitals, and that could, that is because you're meeting a national challenge, and the end objective is to treat the people and not to get them panicky, because these deaths unnecessarily, taking prophylaxis unnecessarily is also not good.
There was a very tangible suggestion that Professor Reddy just made, and he said, look, perhaps scientists and government bodies are not equipped to be the best communicators, so why doesn't the private sector just step in with the right kind of messaging? Did you see that happen, Kewal?
No, we would be very, very open to this.
Yes. Mr. Handa?
I think private sector can play an important role, but I a little bit disagree with Mr. Reddy, is that this role has to be played by the experts. Now, you can train them to communicate it better, but the experts should be in front and telling the masses what's happening. And it's more credibility there than anybody else talking, the bureaucrats talking or the politicians talking.
Communication is at the key of it.
It is the key.
And Thomas, I was wondering, for instance, in a country like Germany, has there been any communication experience that you can share with us here? Because, if there has been one weak block in this, our experience here in India, it's been communication.
Yeah, I agree. Communication and transparency is extremely important. I believe that, in principle, there should be a task force that has the key job to really communicate, if possible, every day to the key stakeholders in the system. I believe that Germany also has not done a very good job if it comes to communication. In the beginning, the government of Germany bought a lot of vaccines, and the media was extremely negative about it, because they said, well, you waste all this money, why do you do this? Because they don't really saw the sense of urgency. And if you would have asked the population in Germany only 2 weeks ago if they would like to get the vaccine, about 90% would have said, no, we don't want to have it. Then, like 2 or 3 people died of swine flu last week, and all of a sudden the whole system has changed. There was panic, and the media really reinforced the panic, and all of a sudden we have huge lines in front of the vaccination offices. And I think this does not make sense. I think the media also has the responsibility to, in one hand, also make sure that there is a problem, but that we have solutions to the problem. And on the other hand, if it really also starts to get a little bit more serious, also to calm down the population and don't really create the panic, because the last thing you'd like to have in this situation is really a panicking population. And I think this is true for probably any country where you have a very good media system, because media lives also from sensation. But I think in this specific case, we don't need sensation. We need really honest.
I'd like to just add, Manvi, the role of pharmaceutical company or so. Now, 70% of the medicines or the vaccines for Mexico was being imported in US. The US requirement of 70% of vaccine was from Mexico. Now, what happens in such cases when the imports are stopped from the countries which is impacted? Now, it's just not only the vaccines which is related to that disease, but imports of everything can stop. What happens to the other life-saving medicines? We're just treating us influenza, but there are people who are taking other life-saving medicines. How do we plan to ensure those life-saving medicines are available? How do we plan to ensure that the immune system medicines are available? How do we ensure that we can step up our production and there's the workforce, because there is a huge absenteeism during that time? I think that is a very critical role an industry has to play, the pharmaceutical industry at that point of time.
Ramesh?
So if I can build on 3 points that the other speakers have talked about. I think, first of all, from the point of view of a private sector organization like Merck, and I dare say many others, both in India and all over the world, all of us take very serious precautions and preparation around what we call business continuity, not only for pandemic preparedness, but others. And we've had the experience in Asia of SARS before, a few years ago, etc. So we, as organizations, global organizations, we have very robust plans in terms of business continuity. Obviously, our business is, as to Kewal's point, we produce essential and other medicines and vaccines beyond the flu. So our role in our ability through these pandemics, which might disrupt our own people, is not only to protect our people, but to be able to continue to deliver on the needs for customers around vaccines and medicines. So I think one of the things that can be done is to look at the very specific activities that individual organizations have, and perhaps share that with either the organization that Dr. Reddy leads or other bodies that the public sector is dealing with, and saying, how are you guys communicating this globally? I mean, we have the same whether we're talking about my business in Taiwan, my business in India, or my business in Germany. So how are we doing that, and are there lessons to be learned that can be applied? Even the content could be easily shared because it's not proprietary, and be shared so that governments can use it between states and center, etc. The second point I want to respond to is this debate that particularly goes on in India about state responsibility for health versus the national central responsibility. This is not the only country in the world where this happens. China has exactly the same problem. The provinces believe it's their subject. If you go to the US, health is a state subject, but the body like a CDC has the credibility. And we keep saying the role of the media, awareness. It's about transparency. It's about having the right facts and not making the shrillness of the tone that occurs in India is particularly high, but having very clearly balanced information that's prepared. China is a classic example. If you went back a few years ago, I mean, they controlled the information centrally. The information was not available. There was no transparency. They've made huge strides in being able to share the information that's actually available. So people have factual information. People still don't panic, etc. But transparency is vital. So I think in terms of whatever data is available, and even the last few days around dengue, you can see the stuff that's going on in India where, there seems to be various bits of information, and the focus becomes on whose information is correct rather than making sure that the facts are well understood and disseminated. The last point I'll make is taking the response and learning from the response of, say, the European systems, healthcare systems versus the US even, through this flu pandemic. If you look at the way the British National Health System is approaching distribution of prophylactic medication as well as antiviral medications to their populations, it's very targeted. There's no discussion in the public sphere about who gets it. They've identified vulnerable populations, healthcare providers in the first instance, nurses, hospitals, clinics, etc. Then they've taken vulnerable populations, school children, pregnant women, and various categories. And they have targeted communication specifically to those people to invite them in for vaccinations. Now, that may not be replicable on a scale like in India, but just taking some of those lessons and saying, state by state, who are the populations we should first protect? Because they are going to be essential in the overall chain. I think there are lessons that can be learned, and we don't have to always go to Europe, by the way. There are tremendous examples in small parts of Asia. I mean, Singapore, for example, the way they look at controlling the distribution of vaccines, even who pays, they make it a personal responsibility issue for individual patients. So I think there are learnings we can draw. I'm an optimist, because I think if you just look from a technical perspective, there are more than 25 companies who are very close to getting regulatory approval for new vaccines for H1N1. I don't think there's ever been a response from industry and technology and the scientific community on a scale like this in such a short time. And kudos again to the regulators. I mean, even China was the first country to fast-track regulatory approval for a domestically produced flu vaccine. I see that happening in India as well, and I think there's grounds for optimism, but not for complacency.
Perhaps I'm getting stuck on one point, but it would be good to see one central body that is credible taking the lead. And I think the question that we perhaps can't answer or won't answer is, which central body will we empower to do its job as the nodal point for this? At this stage, we're going to take questions, and if you could just quickly introduce yourselves, direct the question to a particular panelist, and we can get going, because the idea is to make this as interactive as possible. Anjali Nair.
Yeah, I'm Anjali Nair from Park, and I actually have a question to the audience. So first of all, I really want to congratulate for such an open discussion, and all the speakers have made very valid points. And one thing is this whole idea of public-private partnership. And there are so many things, the big picture public-private partnership that we can talk about. Today we have a number of vaccine-preventable diseases because there are more vaccines available. So where is the government really thinking, or where is the industry thinking about big picture partnership on child tracking, stockpiling? Those are the things that really impact access. For diagnostics, both Merck and QIAGEN have done amazing, to make diagnostics available. But how do we actually get them to the people who need them the most? So there's health infrastructure and there's pricing. These are two big issues.
Thomas, would you like to take that on just basically making it available to the impacted population, and in the Indian context, if possible?
Well, I believe that such a complex task of preparing for a pandemic like this cannot be done by only one stakeholder in the system. It needs to be a multi-functional approach, and I believe that the government must take the lead and must invite the key stakeholder that help really to make the difference, like the pharmaceutical industry, like the diagnostic industry, and maybe also the industry that are not related to the healthcare system, but are also extremely important in a crisis, like, for example, the electricity industry, the food industry, and so forth. And I believe that what we need is really a whole society approach where basically all these stakeholders come together. What we basically as a company have done is that we have in a very early phase have had contacts with different national responsible organizations that basically told us what they expect from us in an early phase and also in a late phase of the pandemics. And it was in some countries really a clear guidance. They wanted to have business continuity plans from us, so they wanted to see what we do to prepare ourselves so that we can deliver in a case like that. And they also wanted to have plans from us where we basically show how we would deliver into the certain areas. For example, we needed to increase production by a factor of 100 for a few products. This cannot be done from one day to another day. So we really need to also prepare ourselves, or entire organization, to achieve that. So it's a very intense time that we have in the past 6 months to really prepare ourselves.
Professor Reddy, how do you think that one can actually implement better preparedness? Preparedness is such a wide term. Where do you start? What do you think?
let me start with preparedness in terms of preventing the pandemics, and then I'll come down to preparedness of the health system as well as the other stakeholders in the society. I had mentioned that most of the recent pandemics or threatened pandemics or recent outbreaks have been animal to human transmitted diseases. Ponder for a moment and recognize that this is essentially because of industrial scale livestock breeding that's going on the world over, which is now resulting in large captive animal populations living in close contact with veterinary populations and human habitat. And these grain-fed animals require a huge amount of deforestation for producing grain. So you're now releasing hitherto contained viruses and vectors from the forest into the veterinary population, into the human population, setting up a conveyor belt for viruses to be transmitted and mutated. So this is where I believe an organization like the World Economic Forum must address some of the upstream determinants, because these have impact also on climate change. This is all part of sustainable development. These are not separate pieces. And you bring together that kind of a economic framework across the world where we take care of climate change, we try and prevent pandemics. We also require a global accord on knowledge sharing. Proprietary science sometimes can be an impediment, and governments too are sometimes responsible for this. We have had difficulties in the past of governments refusing to share viruses which are required for global vaccine production. And that's because they're afraid that they would not have access to the vaccines once they're produced. So you require a social contract between the public sector and the private sector, which says we will prioritize human needs and human health above everything else, and then we will together join hands to produce vaccines as and when needed. Then, of course, in terms of the health system preparedness, we clearly must recognize that we must have a multi-stakeholder framework well prepared and in readiness to respond. We cannot have ad hoc and rushed responses. We need a pre-planned response, very well crafted and implemented. This begins from, as I said, surveillance to hospital facilities to communication strategies. And we do require a central body, as you rightly pointed out, which has multiple functions. There has to be a regulatory function, which is predominantly a government function. Of course, it has to be done in consultation with other stakeholders. But there has to be an implementation function which brings in the best strengths of all other stakeholders. I do agree it is for the scientists to craft the communication message, but the speed and efficiency with which it is disseminated to society should, of course, be the function of others who are also communication specialists. So we need to bring in that. Therefore, what we really require at this point in time is a pandemic preparedness plan which will, ahead of time, identify who are all the key stakeholders required, all the key action points, and then keep it in readiness so that when the occasion does arise, you have everything in ready response state.
Ramesh?
Can I just build on that? I think two things. One is there's obviously a very big short-term issue that the world is facing. And so the tendency will be to deal with all the short-term issues we've got to deal with. It's also, I believe, an opportunity for us to think longer term and say, as we anticipate completely different types of pandemics, maybe not to do with influenza, but something else, how can we prepare us now and create mechanisms? And I'll give one example, which you might know of. Merck recently signed a joint venture with the Wellcome Foundation to create a center based in India for the development of vaccines for developing world illnesses. And this could be even things like, how can we create a vaccine that no longer depends on a cold chain for supply, which is going to be very difficult in the world. So I think thinking long term about this is very important. However, in the short term, to the point about public-private partnerships, there are today already mechanisms that we can leverage. And I think India can certainly, from a central government perspective, leverage this, the concept of an advanced market commitment. So as you think about the risk of vaccine development and the lack of clarity on what demand will be, I mean, what if this pandemic does not happen? People are going to be stuck with stockpiles of vaccines that would be, in some ways, an economic waste. Nobody wants to take that risk, so we will produce vaccine. The question is, can we create an advanced market commitment that allows manufacturers to be able to not only share and pool technology to be effective and quick, but also to defray some of the risk that they're taking, not only in the development cycle, but also that everybody might be end up with either product they don't need or product they can't get to the right place. So I think there are mechanisms already today, and there's an opportunity, I think, perhaps for India to bring together not only vaccine but antiviral manufacturers, actually take advantage of this advanced market commitment framework and do it specifically for India.
You know, Minister Walia, I'm curious to understand, just from the broad thinking behind it, because, you know, we stockpile food grains, and yet there is a hesitance to stockpile medicines. What's your thought on that?
My point, Mr. Ramesh, is very valid, that unless, you know, everyone who's involved shares information and knowledge, this is not possible and not achievable. I'm taking the whole global village also in mind. This sharing of experiences and knowledge has to be even at the global level. That would really help, because we talk of, you know, we hear of vaccine being prepared somewhere and that may come, you know, but anybody in Delhi nowadays, news travels so fast that it's begin to inquire as to when this vaccine is coming. So this sharing of experiences does not have to be trans borders and transnational, and that would really be very, very helpful in terms of all the knowledge that we all have. So this is one point I wish to make, and that I agree with Mr. Ramesh that, you know, at the national level, notwithstanding that health is a state subject, that's why I was proposing that we have to have a national level coordination committee, and where all the state representatives are there and other stakeholders are there. That would, and we should immediately have that. Because, you know, they said dip in temperature, and let me tell you, the last 2 days there have been at least, you know, 5 more cases than there were in the week ago in swine flu. That's how it's popularly known. So this, we cannot just, you know, forget about it. Public memory is very short. So you never know that in a month's time, we have to be like from today.
May I add
to give credit where it is due, let me clarify the issue on advanced market commitments. The union government, at least in terms of the production of acetaminophen, the Tamiflu as it's called, had indeed approached all Indian manufacturers, suggesting that they step up their production, suggesting the levels to which they should step up their production with commitment of advanced government purchase. And they're quite willing to do that for vaccines as well. So I think in those terms, I think already the whole concept of advanced market commitments is well accepted at the government level.
questions?
My name is Anand and I work for Agility Logistics. I had a question on the implementation of prevention. Like most of us have traveled into Delhi and we have seen the airports, and when you enter there is a check about the swine flu. However, I used to wonder as a person who is traveling, is it really effective? Are we adequately resourcing it to make it really effective? If you travel to say Singapore or Hong Kong when the SARS happened, the implementation is quite different and you feel probably assured that you are entering into your country which is going to take care of you. You don't necessarily get the same when you enter India. So I just thought of asking the question on implementation. Is it effective? Are we adequately resourcing? And it's quite a common theme that prevention is better than cure.
Professor Reddy.
Well, containment strategy is always appropriate as the initial response to any new pandemic threat. However, in influenza-like illnesses or in influenzas, the virus spreads so rapidly that it's difficult to contain it. Now, you'll notice that currently 199 countries are considered to be H1N1 positive. Yep. And these include countries where those measures that you have suggested have been implemented right from day one. So it's very difficult to really prevent the entry of such a rapidly spreading virus, especially when travelers who are in the incubation phase, who are not actually exhibiting fever, enter. So while these thermal sensors appear to be very attractive and give the sense of false confidence that something being done very efficiently, that really doesn't help. It has been shown in SARS, it has been shown in avian influenza, it's been repeatedly shown now. That doesn't mean that we should not have surveillance systems which can pick up for containment, particularly when mutant viruses are likely to come in or drug-resistant viruses are likely to come in. You must have your alarm systems and antennae finely honed. But in terms of your specific question, I think those measures have been much more for satisfaction of the policymakers and the media than for actual purpose of public health.
Just to, so that I agree with Dr. Reddy that we shouldn't be carried away with the veneer of sophistication that might be there. However, to give credit to several of those countries that have those things, their follow-up mechanisms once people have left the airport and might exhibit some symptoms, they're pretty strong. So I agree. I mean, the fact that there's nobody in the airport except a machine scanning you may not necessarily be the story, but follow-up is very strong.
I think what we need to strengthen is the contact tracing system. How many people have been in touch with the person who has been tested positive? And if you have that, then you can treat it much faster. Unfortunately, we don't have it, where the partnership with NGOs and private players becomes very critical.
You know, of course, the numbers in India always make it so difficult. It's very intimidating. We just can't wish that away. So when you're talking about a contact tracing system in Singapore, it's a whole different ballgame when you're talking about a contact tracing system in India.
Yeah, but if you have facilities, for example, the private hospitals were not allowed to treat. Now, how do you do that then? If you have that type of facilities and allow the private hospitals to treat it, then it's easier to trace it back.
Could I? In fact, the private hospitals are not coming forward. This is true, it's on record. Otherwise, we would not have had to invoke this particular act. We were requesting them, and they were afraid, that perhaps it would affect their other persons who would be coming to the hospitals, and swine flu had become something like a phobia. So we had to invoke the act to ensure that they prepared the infrastructure for at least a 10-bedded kind of an opportunity for the people who want to visit private hospitals, and also offload the government hospitals. So it's, even for the labs, they were quite willing, but for the, fixing swine flu wards, they were not willing at all.
Can I perhaps make a completely different kind of comment, which is that I think there's also got to be campaigns, perhaps with the help of the media and other agencies, to create a sense of responsibility around this as well. This is not something that just happens to people. That you can do and take measures for yourself, for your family, etc. Simple measures around, sanitation, cleaning your hands, etc., etc. And it's interesting, in the middle of the summer when, or in the summertime, when this thing was spreading, I recall making several trips to China where I can tell you people were afraid to board the plane because they knew when you landed, the Chinese authorities would enter the plane, they wouldn't let you off. They would screen people on the plane, even the slightest variation in temperature, they would not only quarantine you, but about 6 rows of people sitting around you, right? And I can tell you that people were taking, paracetamol pills an hour and a half before landing, just in case their temperature. So I think there needs to be some creation of a campaign of personal awareness. I mean, it's always, this is going to happen to somebody else, not to me. And I think these are simple measures which, frankly, are much more effective than, and much more cheaper than having vaccines for everybody. So I think.
Though I have to say that in schools in Delhi, and I, from first-hand experience, one did see the schools, the teachers, the administration making the effort. We have time for one question because I believe that security is going to be really tight for the Prime Minister's session. So I do have my colleague Bianca here from NDTV, but I'm going to request her for 1 second to see if there's actually anybody else who'd like to ask a question. There you go, Bianca.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Bianca, as Manvi mentioned. My question is to Minister Walia. You've just been talking about how the private sector has a huge responsibility in terms of liaising with the government, and then you did give the example that Genpact, for example, was running a successful call-in assistance model. Now, and it's not just one-off. You also have Genpact working successfully in the Loknayak Hospital. Yes. You have BSR Apollo doing some fantastic work in Bhilai in terms of pediatric cardiac care. So my question to you is, what is it that the government is waiting for? Why are we still talking and debating about the need for a central nodal agency when we actually have a couple of these PPP models setting the standards for us?
Well, we need a national level committee to coordinate at a national level, and sharing experiences coming from various states. And these would definitely help each other. For example, I don't wish to say that, but Delhi perhaps foresaw many things which some other cities did not. So, it's like the contact teams that we're talking about. And we were also doing this, checking who this passenger had come in contact was, finding out from the airports who were the people sitting on the front seats and who were the ones sitting behind them. And, it was like taking to a point. And what Madhvi is saying is true, that, I just wish to say that when our contact teams were around, once this disease, like it spreads, then I don't think it will be possible to go around, contacting every person. Because here's a person, our schools were affected by just 4 families who had gone on a trip abroad to Thailand and Singapore. And these children were from different schools because there were different families who had gone together. And that's how the whole infection began. So, it was so difficult to trace that who these children had met. And as an anecdote, this one person who had, basically brought this infection, we contacted each person that he had met. Ultimately, there's a ceremony in India, it's a condolence ceremony which he had gone to, and obviously that we landed up that, okay, if you have met 500 people there, that's the end of it. We can't go contacting beyond a point. So your particular point that you're talking about, I'm very happy that even the GTZ is giving us kind of an advice on the quality benchmarks that we need to in our hospitals. GenPAC has gone even further in managing our emergency services as a CSR responsibility. And so there is that very good aspect of it also. But I can see the initial hiccups because private hospitals may be having their own problems in setting up infrastructure, have separate entrances, separate exits. There are engineering problems and so on. We were able to appreciate that, so we waited very patiently for them to build these. And I'm sure that on the bedrock of this experience, anything that happens in future, we are having far more meetings with them and far more interactive than initially things were different.
But you did say that the private sector hasn't really, come up to the government. So as the private face of this panel, Mr. Handa, Mr. Subramaniam, do you think that the private sector is up for it? For a PPP model, it would mean huge accountability and responsibility.
Before anybody, I just must say that yes, this was initially the issue. But now we see we have 5 private hospitals ready with their wards. But this is necessary. This is true that there was initial resistance, please.
Unfortunately, we don't have any of the hospitals represented here, so they cannot defend themselves or put their point of view forward. We have Pfizer and Merck to give their perspective, and I think they've shared some of the ideas of what they're doing to help the government. But Kewal, let me not track the answer you were about to give.
I think, we do our bit, and we wanted to ensure that the essential medicines which are being used by other patients are available. Because the supply chain, to maintain the continuity of supply chain, is very, very critical. That's a very important role. And as far as our stakeholders are concerned, we did put all the things in place in IT resilience, workforce resilience, and people resilience, things in place. So to ensure that we contain it within at least our workforce and ensure that our people follow these hygienic practices, not only in the offices, but also when they go back home, they follow the same practices. So to that extent, we did play a lot of role in the awareness program in and around our community where our plants are there. We did spread a lot of awareness program. So we did chip and roll, but I think we need to have a structure in place to get the private people as a part of the partnership process. And once the structure is in place, I'm sure there are a whole lot of private companies like Merck and Pfizer would chip in.
Specific point, Merck, while we're not involved in seasonal flu vaccines, we do have a vaccine for pneumococcal disease, which is a very significant secondary infection coming out of influenza, etc. And we're working with governments across the world in terms of their need for that vaccine, and in fact making sure that the distribution of that vaccine is allocated by the priority that's set by governments and not by the purchasers. So we are working with governments. Obviously, managing scarce resources is a very critical time, and this is really the time when the public-private partnership needs to be strengthened.
We're all out of time, so Thomas, I'm going to leave this final thought to you. As QIAGEN, it's the first company in the world that came up with a commercial test for H1N1, and it is a world leader in swine flu testing and avian flu testing. You have interacted with many global bodies. Tell me, what is that final thought you want to place on the table in terms of preparing for pandemics, managing pandemics, and responses, government and private?
I'd like to end with let's learn. Let's learn from what we learned from this pandemic and make sure that for the next pandemic, which will come, it can come next year, it can come in 10 years. Let's learn, let's apply best practice within a country. Let's learn who is the best hospital, who is the best testing facility, make sure that the other testing facilities learn from the best practice in a country and then also beyond the country. And if we do this, I believe then a pandemic does not need to be a threat to the population.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. And I think one should put the alert out on behalf of the World Economic Forum that you are required to be in your seats by 10:30 for the next session.